The Varith ship dropped out of faster-than-light travel like a stone falling into still water, silent, sudden, and heavy with intention. It hung above the third planet in the system, a blue-green world wrapped in thin clouds, and Commander Sale pressed 4 fingers against the observation glass, studying it the way a surgeon studies a body before making the first cut. She had done this 47 times before. 47 first contacts. 47 species assessed, catalogued, and quietly filed into the Varith Empire's great ledger of lesser minds. It was not a cruel process, she believed. It was simply efficient. The Varith possessed the gift of deep reading, the ability to touch a consciousness and see everything inside it. Every memory, every fear, every secret a creature had ever tried to bury. No species had ever hidden anything from them. No species had ever surprised them. She did not expect the humans to be different. The planet's largest political structures had been mapped already. Radio signals decoded. Language banks filled. Her translator device hummed softly against her wrist, loaded with 17 of the dominant planet's spoken languages. The humans were a young species, barely 12,000 years of recorded civilization, barely 300 years into industrial development. They had split the atom less than a century ago and were still fighting each other over the boundaries of their tiny land divisions. In Varith terms, they were children. Loud, messy, barely organized children. Sale selected one for the first reading. The process was simple. A beam. A brief moment of unconsciousness. A mind laid open like a book. She had explained this to junior officers as something like reading a room. You walked in, you looked around, you understood everything there was to understand, and then you left. The subject rarely even remembered the intrusion. At most, they woke with a headache and a vague sense that something had been nearby. The human they selected was male, middle-aged by his species standards, living alone in a small structure at the edge of one of the northern continent's rural zones. His brain activity patterns were typical, the usual churn of surface thoughts, memories running just below consciousness, the low electrical hum of a mind going about its ordinary evening. He was eating. He was watching a screen. He was thinking about nothing in particular. Sale initiated the deep read. She stepped into his mind expecting a shallow pool. What she found was something else entirely. The first layer was ordinary enough. His name was Thomas. He was 53 years old. He had a daughter he loved very much, and a broken truck he kept meaning to fix, and a neighbor whose dog made too much noise at night. His surface thoughts were simple things. The food he was eating was too salty. He was tired. Tomorrow was supposed to rain. Sale moved deeper, the way she always did, pushing through the soft upper membrane of daily thought and into the architecture of deeper memory. She stopped. There was something strange in the structure. Not strange in the way that suggested intelligence or complexity, strange in the way that suggested damage. Sale had read thousands of minds across dozens of species, and she knew what psychological scarring looked like. She had seen it in the minds of prey species who carried inherited terror in their neurons, encoded in the very chemistry of thought. She had seen it in warrior species who had experienced trauma and learned to wall off portions of memory. She recognized both patterns. Thomas had something different, something she did not have a name for yet. It was not fear exactly. It was not pain exactly. It was more like the memory of a fire that had burned so long ago that the ash had cooled and the person standing in it had simply gotten used to the warmth under their feet. It ran through every layer of him, not just the obvious memories of hardship, but threaded into the very way he processed the world. The way he woke up in the morning already calculating what could go wrong. The way he smiled and simultaneously kept one part of himself separate, watching, waiting. Sale withdrew slightly. She flagged the pattern and pushed into the memory clusters just below the surface. She found his childhood. His father had left when he was 7. His mother had worked 3 jobs. There had been winters with not enough heat and summers with not enough food. There had been a period of illness, his own, untreated for too long because treatment cost money they did not have. There had been a school where other children were cruel and the teachers were too tired to notice. There had been years where the accumulation of small injuries had pressed so consistently against him that Thomas had simply adapted. Not healed, not recovered. Adapted. The way a tree grows around a nail driven into its trunk. The wood doesn't remove the nail. The wood simply grows through it and keeps growing. She went deeper. She found the grief layer. Every mind had one, the region where loss lived. In most species, it was a concentrated area, a visible wound in the mental landscape. In Thomas, it was distributed, spread everywhere. His grief was not a wound. It was part of the architecture. It had been absorbed so completely into the structure of who he was that it had become load-bearing. Remove it, and the whole building would lose its shape. Sale realized she had been inside his mind for 3 times longer than a standard reading. She could not stop looking. It was not pity that kept her there. The Verith did not pity lesser species any more than a geologist pities a rock formation. What kept her there was something closer to professional alarm. She had assessed 47 species. She had read thousands of individual minds. And she had never once seen this particular configuration of suffering and functionality existing in the same space without one destroying the other. In every other species she had encountered, heavy psychological damage meant reduced function. Broken things worked poorly. A mind carrying what Thomas carried should have been a mind incapable of ordinary life. And yet, he was eating his salty dinner. He was watching his screen. He was planning to fix his truck on the weekend. The damage and the ordinary life existed side by side in him, not in conflict, but in a strange and terrible partnership. She withdrew from the reading and sat for a long moment in the quiet of the observation room. Then she called her second officer in and told her to prepare a broader sample. She needed to know if Thomas was an exception or a pattern. She already suspected, with a cold and growing certainty, that he was not an exception, that he was exactly, precisely, horrifyingly average. The second reading was a woman named Priya, 41 years old, a nurse in a large city on the southern end of the northern continent's eastern coast. She worked 12-hour shifts in a place where sick people came to either get better or to die, and she was the one who stood between them and whatever came next. She had been doing this for 16 years. Sale entered her mind carefully, already watching for the pattern she had found in Thomas. She found it within seconds. Priya's damage was different in its specifics, but structurally identical. Where Thomas carried the accumulated weight of poverty and loneliness, Priya carried something built from repeated exposure to loss. She had watched people die, many people, over many years, and the human mind was not, Sale noted with clinical precision, designed for that. Other species who worked with death either developed a clean psychological wall between themselves and the dying, or they broke under the weight of it. Priya had done neither. She had developed something the Verith had no category for, a way of caring intensely about each individual person while simultaneously holding the knowledge that loss was coming and that the loss was survivable. Not painless, not easy, survivable. She went to work each morning knowing she would likely watch someone die that day. She went anyway. Sale pulled back and flagged the reading. Then she opened the third file. A young man, 24 years old, living in a coastal city on a different continent entirely. His name was Marcus. His recent memory cluster was lit up with economic anxiety, the kind that Sale recognized as a condition of resource scarcity combined with systemic obstacles to improvement. He was working 2 jobs, sleeping very little, sending money to his mother, and studying for a certification test in the small hours before dawn. The sleep deprivation alone was enough to show in his neural patterns. There was a kind of gray fog over his cognition, a persistent low-level exhaustion that had clearly been present for months. And yet, the planning centers of his brain were some of the most active Sale had ever seen in a young human. He was not merely surviving his circumstances. He was architecting a way out of them. Every spare moment was directed toward a specific future that did not yet exist. He was building it in his mind long before it was real, and that imagined future was functioning as a structural support for a present that should, by reasonable assessment, have already broken him. Sale read for more humans before she stopped. She sat very still in the observation room for a long time. Then she brought her findings to the ship's psychoscience officer, a senior Verith named Duth who had the kind of calm that only comes from decades of doing the same job very well. Duth reviewed the flagged readings with methodical patience. He made notes. He cross-referenced patterns. He ran the data through the Verith's accumulated knowledge base, 47 species, thousands of individual readings, centuries of documented psychological profiles. When he finished, he looked at Sale with an expression she had not seen on his face before. "There is no analog for this," he said. "None at all. Nothing close. He turned back to the data. Every species we have encountered carries psychological damage in one of three configurations. The first type is compartmentalized. The damage is sealed off, kept separate from function, and the individual operates normally until the seal breaks. The second type is integrated but diminishing. The damage is present everywhere, but gradually reduces function over time, like a slow leak. The third type is breaking, acute damage actively destroying function in real time. He paused. These humans show none of these configurations. Then what do they show? Duth was quiet for a moment. They show damage that has been metabolized, converted, turned into something that is not exactly strength, not exactly resilience, something more like fuel. They are running on it. Sel thought about Thomas and his salty dinner and his plans for the weekend. She thought about Priya going to work knowing what was waiting for her. She thought about Marcus building an invisible future in the dark hours before dawn. How is that possible? I don't know yet. Duth pulled up a secondary set of readings. But look at this. I ran the sample broader while you were reviewing. I picked readings at random across different continents, different social conditions, different ages. The pattern holds. Not universally. There are humans whose damage is breaking them, and there are humans whose damage is compartmentalized in the more familiar configurations. But the majority, the statistical majority of this species, shows this pattern to some degree. The majority, Sale repeated, which suggests it is not individual variation. It is a species-wide adaptation. Duth set down his notes. They have been carrying this for a long time, Commander. Long enough that it has become part of how they function. Long enough that their psychology has reorganized around it. Sale stood and walked to the observation glass again. The blue-green planet hung there, cloud-wrapped and apparently peaceful. From this distance, it looked like a quiet world. A gentle world. She had read the radio signals. She knew it was not gentle. The humans had been at war with each other, in various combinations and configurations, for as far back as their historical records extended. They had developed technologies capable of ending all life on their planet and had then not used them, had instead lived for decades with the knowledge that such an ending was possible and had continued anyway, building cities, making art, having children, watching screens and eating salty food and planning to fix their trucks. I want to run an active read, Sale said. Duth looked at her. A full deep read? Not just passive observation. Not just passive. I want to go into a human's memory under controlled conditions and follow the damage to its root. I want to see where this began, how it formed, what it actually is at its origin point. That will require waking them. A passive read can be done without awareness, but a full deep read at root level, they will feel it. I know. They may resist. Sale turned from the window. Every species resists. None of them can stop it. She believed that was true. She had never met a mind that could resist a Verith deep red once it was fully initiated. No walls were strong enough. No consciousness was fast enough. The Verith simply went in and read what was written there, regardless of what the subject wanted. She had never been wrong about that before. She was about to be. They selected the subject carefully, someone whose psychological profile showed the metabolized damage pattern in its clearest form. A man named Daniel, 61 years old, who had survived things that Sale, reading the summary of his life from the outside, would have classified as incompatible with continued functional existence. And yet there he was, functional, more than functional. He had a quiet kind of groundedness that showed up in his neural patterns as something very close to what the Verith called deep-settled cognition, the signature of a mind that knew itself completely. Sale initiated the beam. Daniel's eyes opened. He did not look afraid. He looked, instead, like a man who had been expecting a knock at the door and was simply waiting to see who was there. That was the first thing that surprised her. She had not been expected. No human had ever looked at the moment of contact the way he looked. Not with fear, not with confusion, but with a kind of weary, patient recognition. As if some part of him had always known that something like this would come. As if he had made room for it. She went in, and the mind she found waiting for her inside was not a pool. It was a canyon, deep and ancient and full of echoes. And somewhere at the bottom of it, something was already looking back. No Verith had ever been pushed out of a mind. It was not something that happened. It was not something that could happen. A deep read, once initiated, was a one-directional process. The reader went in, gathered what was needed, and withdrew at their own choosing. The subject's consciousness had no mechanism to intervene. The subject did not even know, in most cases, what was being taken. They lay there in the temporary fog of the contact beam, and their memories and fears and secrets were simply read, the way a library is read, with no permission required and no resistance possible. Sale had been inside Daniel's mind for approximately 4 minutes when she felt it. Not a wall, not a barrier, something more like a current. A slow, deep, irresistible movement in the architecture of the mind she was moving through, as if the canyon she had entered had a river running through its lowest point, and the river had begun to flow toward her. She adjusted her technique, going deeper rather than broader, trying to route around it. The movement followed. Not aggressive, not fast, just persistent. The way water is persistent. The way time is persistent. She went to the grief layer, because in every mind the grief layer was still. The dead things in a mind did not move. Daniel's grief was not still. It was the most active thing in him. It did not sit in one place the way grief usually sat, heavy and concentrated, like a stone at the center of things. It was distributed, as she had seen in the first broad readings, threaded everywhere. But here, in the full depth of the active red, she could see what she had not been able to see from the surface. It was not just distributed. It was organized. It had been worked. The way metal is worked by a smith, heated and hammered and shaped over and over until it is no longer just material but structure. Daniel had taken 61 years of accumulated loss and turned it into the frame of himself. She tried to find the origin point, the way she always did, the first injury, the foundational wound that everything else had grown around. In most minds this was clear. A single event, or a period of events, standing out from the surrounding memory the way a scar stands out from ordinary skin. She went deeper into his past. She found it. She was not prepared for what she found. It was not one thing. It was not even 10 things. It was an unbroken chain of difficulty stretching back to his earliest conscious memories. A childhood marked by instability, adolescence defined by the specific kind of loneliness that comes when a young mind has no model for how to understand itself, early adulthood fractured by loss and error, and the particular brutality of learning the world's nature the hard way. Loss of a parent too early. A marriage that had begun with love and ended with something quieter and sadder. A period of years that he thought of. She could feel the label he had given it, worn smooth from long use, as the dark time. Medical crisis. Financial ruin. The slow return from both. And then, and this was the part that stopped her completely, a period of something she did not have a Verith word for. She searched the language banks. Found nothing exact. The closest translation she could manage was something like, the ordinary continuation of life after understanding that it will not be different. He had not recovered in the sense of returning to a previous state. He had not transcended his suffering in the way the meditative species of System Rho 7 transcended theirs, through disciplined mental practice and the deliberate cultivation of distance from the self. He had not sealed it away. He had not been made numb by it. He had simply continued, day after day, year after year, carrying the full weight of everything that had happened, putting one foot in front of the other, and in doing so, had built something that she was only now, standing in the middle of it, beginning to understand was enormous. The weight had not crushed him. The weight had become his floor. Sel tried to pull back. She wanted to withdraw, regroup, bring Duth in for a second opinion. This was beyond the scope of a standard read. She was operating in territory that had no map. She found she could not immediately pull back. The current she had noticed earlier had grown while she was focused on the grief layer. It was not hostile. She wanted to be precise about that, because she had encountered hostile minds before, and this was not that. It was not trying to trap her or harm her. It was simply present. A kind of attention had turned toward her, slow and heavy and very old, and it was holding her there not out of malice, but out of something closer to recognition. Daniel knew she was there. Not in the way subjects sometimes had a vague sense of intrusion, the headache, the fog, the brief disorientation that passed in minutes. He knew. He was looking directly at her with the interior equivalent of eyes, and he was not afraid, and he was not angry, and he was not struggling. He was waiting, with the patient quality of a man who had learned to wait by spending a lifetime at it. She spoke. It was not the standard protocol. Communication during a deep read was almost never done, but she found herself doing it before she had consciously decided to. "You know I am here," she said into the connection. The answer came back without words. It came back as a feeling, transmitted through the reed the same way memories transmitted, not language, but direct experience. He sent back something that felt like, yes, and something that felt like, I have been here before. Not with you specifically, but with this. With something that came from outside and expected to find a small thing and found something else. She understood, suddenly, that he was not speaking metaphorically. He had survived enough that his mind had essentially become practiced at being invaded, not by a Varith beam, but by fear, by grief, by the grinding force of a world that had never been gentle with him. He had been read before, not by her kind, by life, and he had learned, the hard way, the only way humans seemed to learn things, that the reading did not end him, that the thing looking in could see everything he was, and still he would remain. Still he would continue. She realized with a disorientation she had never felt in 47 first contacts, not reading him. She was meeting him, and she searched for the word, found it in the human's own language banks, unimpressed. Not because she was not powerful, not because he did not understand the position he was in, but because he had stood in positions like this before, positions where something enormous and indifferent had looked into the center of him with the full intention of finding nothing worth keeping. And he had already learned, at a cost she was only beginning to understand, that he disagreed. She gathered herself and pushed toward the withdrawal. The current released her. Not immediately, gradually, with the same unhurried quality it had shown throughout, as if it were making sure she had seen enough before she left. She came back to herself in the observation room, sitting in her chair, with no memory of sitting down. Duth was standing near the door with an expression she had never seen on him. "You were in there for 40 minutes, he said. She had thought it was 4. She looked at the planet through the glass. She said nothing for a long moment. "They have survived things," she finally said, "that were trying to kill them. Not once. Not occasionally. As a way of life. And they have been doing it long enough that their minds have changed shape around the survival." She stopped. "I don't think we should continue the assessment using standard protocols." Duth said, carefully, "Is it the species that concerns you? Or the individual?" Sale thought of Daniel, patient and unimpressed in his canyon of a mind, waiting to see what the thing from outside would do next. "Both," she said, "but mostly the species." She turned from the window. "Pull every reading we gathered. I want to understand exactly what we are looking at before we take another step. Because I do not think we understood what we came here to do." The full analysis took 11 days. Duth worked without sleep for most of it, which was unusual for him. He had the obsessive, slightly hollow look of a researcher who had found something genuinely new, which was itself unusual. The Varith had been cataloging species for 800 years. Genuine novelty was rare enough to be unsettling. Sale reviewed the compiled readings every evening. She had stopped thinking of the humans as children. She was not sure, yet, what she had started thinking of them as. But it was not children. The word that kept returning to her, unbidden, was survivors. Not in the ordinary sense. Every species that had not gone extinct was, technically, a survivor. In a more specific, more precise sense. A sense that implied not just the fact of continuing to exist, but the skill of it. The practiced, honed, passed down through generations skill of remaining in the world when the world was doing its level best to end you. The data that Duth assembled was comprehensive and, in places, genuinely difficult to read. The humans had been shaped by a planet that had never been kind to them. The geological record alone, which Sale reviewed out of a kind of compelled thoroughness, showed a world of constant violent change. Ice ages that had nearly ended the species. Volcanic events that had disrupted climate systems for centuries. Disease events that had killed between 1/3 and 1/2 of the total population within living memory. And that was before accounting for the things the humans had done to each other, which were, Sale paused over this section of the report for a long time, numerous. The humans had hurt each other in ways and at scales that even Duth, who had read the psychological imprints of 47 species, flagged as remarkable. And they had kept going. Not despite the hurt, or around the hurt, or separate from the hurt. Through it, carrying it, making it part of the struggle. The individuals who have experienced the most difficulty are not, on average, the most broken. They are, on average, the most substantial. In the psychological sense, they have more interior room. more tolerance for contradiction, more capacity to continue when continuation makes no logical sense. Another pause. I want to be careful about how I say this next part. Say it clearly. The pain is load-bearing. He said it simply, without drama. The human psyche does not heal from its deepest wounds by removing them. It heals by integrating them, by building the rest of the self around them, using them as anchors. Which means that a human who has survived significant suffering is not a weakened version of a human. They are a denser version, a version with more structure, a version that is, in certain measurable respects, harder to destroy than a human who has not been tested. Sel thought about this for a long time. She thought about all 47 species. She ran the comparison in her head, the way she had run it professionally 100 times. She knew the species that were strong through physical power. She knew the species that were strong through numbers, or through speed, or through the cold mechanical efficiency of intelligence uncomplicated by emotion. She knew the species that seemed weak but had hidden reserves. None of them had this. None of them had turned their own damage into the foundation they stood on. They don't know they're doing it, she said. Not consciously. No, they think they're broken. Many of them, yes. Many of them believe their suffering has made them lesser, that the things they carry are evidence of failure, that they should have come through it cleaner, lighter, more intact. Duth shook his head slowly. They have almost no framework for understanding what they have actually become. Sale stood and walked to the window. The planet was the same blue-green it had always been, clouds moving slowly over the curved face of it, ordinary and patient-looking. Thomas was down there somewhere, planning to fix his truck. Priya was going to work. Marcus was studying in the early hours before dawn. Daniel was just living, just existing in his canyon of a mind with the quiet unimpressedness of someone who had already faced everything that could come and had already decided how he felt about it. She thought about what it would mean to continue the assessment, to do what the Empire's protocol called for: observe, evaluate, classify, and decide. She knew what classification the initial report would have suggested before Duth's deeper work. Pre-technological, fractured, fractious. The standard recommendation for species at this stage was a combination of containment and monitoring if the species showed expansionist tendencies, or simple cataloging if they did not. A note in the ledger, a flag on the star system, a periodic scan every few decades to track development. She no longer thought that was the right framework. What, she said carefully, happens when they reach space? Duth was quiet for a moment. The projections are not complete yet. Your best estimate. My best estimate, he said, and stopped. He seemed to be organizing his words with unusual care. My best estimate is that a species whose psychological default is to continue, regardless of obstacle, regardless of damage, regardless of the logical case for stopping, will be very difficult to contain once it leaves its home system. Not because of technology, not because of numbers or weapons or strategy, but because the thing that stops most species at the critical junctures of expansion is the weight of the cost. The cost becomes too high. The losses accumulate past the point where continuation makes sense, and they stop. He looked at her steadily. The humans have already solved for that. They have been solving for it for their entire existence on their home planet. The cost being too high is not a variable. They respond to the way other species respond to it. They just adjust. They grieve. They carry it. They continue. Sale kept her eyes on the planet. They are not the most powerful species we have encountered, she said. No, they are not the most intelligent, not the most technologically advanced, not the most organized. Not yet. She felt the weight of those two words settle into the room. Write the full report, she said. Flag it at the highest level. I want every council member to read it before anyone makes a recommendation about this system. She pressed her fingers against the glass one more time, looking at the blue-green world with its clouds and its billions of small, ordinary lives, each one carrying its history the way Daniel carried his, the way Priya carried hers, the way all of them carried theirs, not as a wound, not as a weight to be put down, but as the thing that had made them. Because I think, she said slowly, that we have been asking the wrong question about this species. We came here asking whether they were worth noting. What we should have been asking is whether we are ready to be noticed by them. She withdrew her hand from the glass. The planet continued, patient and unhurried, below. It had been doing this for a very long time. It was very good at it.